Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this FS Club ESOP Centre webinar event with me, Ian Harris, as your chair. And I'm delighted to introduce once again David Craddock, who is the founder and director of David Craddock Consultancy Services. This is part of his irregular series on employee share ownership schemes. And today he's going to be talking to us about innovative tax techniques for employee share schemes. I can't often say this when introducing people, but on this topic, I really can say this. David is one of the leading, if not the leading expert on these subjects. He's the author of the Tolly's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, and he has made many decades of his working life devoted to this subject. So it's always a real pleasure to have David with us and talk about this subject today. You already know who I am. The FS Club is all of these wonderful organisations and people, I would like to just say a few words of thanks to this group before we start, and indeed I will again when we end, because without the forbearance and sponsorship of FS Club members, we wouldn't be possible to have this very wide range of topics on our webinar and events program. Specifically in the ESOP Centre part of our activity, these are the members and sponsors. And again, the ESOP Centres simply wouldn't exist and wouldn't be able to cover all of these areas for us were it not for these organisations and their sponsorship, forbearance, and indeed attendance. Many of you will come from these organisations today. Very straightforward agenda. My introduction hopefully will be less than 5 minutes, in fact. And we'll then have a keynote presentation from David, which will be roughly 20 minutes or so. We've allowed roughly 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. That's very often with these, a very interesting and lively part of the event. You have a questions button in your GoToWebinar screen, and I would ask you please to use that mechanism for getting your questions to us. Some of you will have our email addresses and know how to get hold of us in other ways. We're sort of locked into this GoToWebinar world for the next 45 minutes, and we won't see any messages you send any other way until after the event. So please use the GoToWebinar system for sending your questions or comments, and we will try to address as many of them as we can. We usually manage to get through, if not all of them, then most of them, and David will attempt to follow up with you if you do ask a late question and we're not able to cover it during the session today. I've already introduced David, so really it's now simply for me to hand over to David and let David tell you how it is about innovative tax techniques for employee share schemes.
Well, thank you, Ian, and very pleased again to share with you through this webinar format. That first slide tells you something about my business, specialist in employee share ownership, reward management, share valuation management, buyouts, employee ownership trusts, and indeed employee share trusts of all types, and investment education. So let's go to the next slide. And on this slide, I introduce the subject for today, which is innovative tax techniques for employee share schemes. So I don't pretend that this is an exhaustive list of innovative tax techniques. It's a flavor. There's definitely more from where these come from, even in my quiver. So it really begs the question, why is there the need for innovative tax techniques? Well, in the UK, there are 4 so-called tax advantageous employee share schemes, historically known as the tax approved schemes. They have bespoke legislation. They are the same as related share option scheme, the company share option plan, the share incentive plan, and enterprise management incentives. But these schemes operate with limitations. The limitations are actually built into the legislation. Also, it might be the case that a given company structure may not allow for the introduction of these schemes. However, all is not lost. This is where the innovative tax techniques come in. It is possible to develop commercially effective, tax-efficient employee share scheme structures using the general legislation, and therefore I often refer to these type of arrangements as the general legislation schemes. Notably from the Income Tax Earnings and Pensions Act 2003, and also various elements from within the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992, which is where we find the share valuation legislation and also the legislation relating to share reconstructions, reorganizations and reclassifications. So LTIPs, as we call it, includes section 431 tax selection opportunities. These are absolutely key to working with most of these scheme arrangements, these innovative tax techniques. I'll point them out as we go through. With regard to the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992, as I've already mentioned, we find in there the share valuation provisions, notably section 272, which when combined with the very informative case law on share valuation can be very, very powerful indeed in finding solutions for employee share schemes. Let's go to the next slide. So this is what I call the general share option scheme. There's lots and lots of points which I could mention on this, and I'm just using this opportunity to share one example that comes from the general share option scheme. This is often called the unapproved share option scheme. By unapproved, we're talking about unapproved by HMRC. And this example is designed to illustrate how the introduction of a discount in the calculation of the option price, in the setting of the option price, if you will, at the time the option is granted, can compensate for any tax that is subsequently payable on the exercise of the option. So suppose that a tax-approved CSOP, company share option plan, is granted at an option price of £5. The £5 in the example represents the market value of the shares at the time the option is granted. At the same time, we actually grant an option under the unapproved share option scheme, the general share option scheme. We set the price at £1, but the market value is £5, as we've already said. So a discount of £4 has been introduced in the setting of the option price for the unapproved share option scheme, the general share option scheme. Some years later, the employee exercises both options at the same time. What is the outcome? The outcome is as follows. The income gain that arises on the exercise of the CSOP option, the gross gain in income tax terms equals the net gain in income tax terms, which is £5. For the unapproved scheme, it's £5.40. So what's happened? Well, in this example, the discount at grant has more than compensated for the anticipated income tax charge arising at exercise. Let's just go to the next slide, which summarizes this principle in diagrammatic form. The reason why I provide all this information from you on the notes is because for years I used to go to seminars and be really frustrated at just seeing 5 bullets and 5 words alongside. So I've always taken the view that I should provide an informative slideshow for people so that they can go back to the slides and learn and digest and make sure that they understand the principles thoroughly enough so as to be able to apply them in their own circumstances, or indeed to talk to an advisor, myself or any other, subsequently informatively about what they want for their company. So you can see here the income tax effect. £10 is the market value at date of exercise. The option price for the CSOP goes from £5 to £10. CSOP options, by the way, can never be set as an option price at less than market value. The unapproved goes from £1 to £10. So take off 40% tax from the £9 increase, and the income tax effect is to leave a net gain of £5.40 compared with that net gain of £5 for the CSOP. Now, interestingly, of course, for the unapproved, the £10 is then the base cost for capital gains tax purposes. Well, if you sell immediately on exercise, there's going to be no capital gains tax, so the total net gain is £5.40. On the CSOP side of things, well, the base cost is the market value at date of grant. So that net gain of £5 is going to come down even further when you take into account the capital gains tax effect. For clarity, of course, I've set this slide as showing the income tax effect only. Let's go to the next slide. This talks about the phantom share option scheme. So this is where maybe a company has hit the headroom limits in terms of the availability of shares, or alternatively simply doesn't want to allocate real shares, but at the same time it actually does want to actually introduce an incentive based upon the growth in the share value. So this type of scheme, think of this as some form of deferred compensation scheme, which is based upon the increase in the share value. So here's the example. Suppose we have a phantom option granted over a notional number of 5,000 shares. Suppose also that the option price is set at £1. Now remember, under this phantom arrangement, it's never ever the case that the employee takes title to the shares. This is a calculation based upon a notional number of shares, which is introduced purely for calculation purposes. So the £1 represents the market value of the shares at the time the option is granted. Some years later, the employee exercises the option. Well, for a phantom, the technical term is actually not exercise the option, although that's what we use colloquially. The technical term is that the employee exercises the right to call upon the company for a sum of money that's calculated on the basis of a rise in the share price from the date of grant to the date of exercise. So the market value at the date of exercise is £5. So the delivery of cash by the company as taxable emoluments is calculated by multiplying the 5,000 notional number by the increase in market value from £1 to £5, which is 4 multiplied by 5,000 shares is £20,000. The £20,000 is subject to income tax, it's subject to national insurance contributions, it's therefore processed accordingly through the PAYE system. So it's not very tax efficient for the employee, but it is taxable emoluments, and therefore, like any remuneration, it's subject to a corporation tax deduction for the company. Let's go to the next slide, which summarizes this position in a diagram. On the next slide. On the next slide, it summarizes a position in a diagram where you can see that increase from £1 to £5. That's the increase in market value. At that new market value, the right to call is exercised, and the taxable increase in value is £4 for the employee, all subject to the corporation tax deduction for the employer, the employing company. Right, let's go to the next slide. So on this next slide, I've set out a calculation of a long-term incentive plan. Okay, now this slide assumes that the company is also eligible for enterprise management incentives. And what I've done here is to compare the implications for the long-term incentive plan in tax terms of not using the EMI arrangement compared with using the EMI arrangement. So if we embed the enterprise management incentives concepts into the long-term incentive plan, what we find is that we have a significant reduction in the incidence for income tax. Let's go to the next slide. So the calculation for you to go to in your own time. The employee share trust. So this is the classic model of the employee share trust. What this explanation is designed to demonstrate is the movement of cash and the movement of shares in as tax efficient a way as possible within an employee share scheme arrangement. So an employee share trust will act as a trading mechanism for the shares. It will work alongside a bona fide employee share scheme. So let's give you some flavor of how this operates. The structural steps are as follows. Step 1, the company makes cash contribution to an offshore trust. Step 2, the trust uses the cash to purchase shares from the existing shareholders. Step 3, in due course, the trust transfers the shares to the employees, either to satisfy exercise of options which have been granted under a standalone employee share option scheme, or to meet some other obligation arising from employee rights to shares, maybe to have shares gifted to them, as I say, for the company to dispense freely those shares to the employees. So what are the consequences of these arrangements? Well, cash is transferred from company to the existing shareholders via the offshore trust. You see that cash goes first to the trust, then out to the shareholders. Shares are then transferred from the existing shareholders to the employees, again via the offshore trust. Again, you'll see that, won't you, that the shares are transferred to the trust first, then the trust transfers them out to the employees. So this arrangement will offer the opportunity of efficient tax treatment as follows. Remember, we're working with an offshore trust. Corporation tax relief for the company, which is independent of the status of the trust, whether there's a trust in existence or not, let alone onshore or offshore, corporation tax relief for the company, capital gains tax treatment for the existing shareholders selling their shares to the trust as a third-party transaction, income tax reliefs for the employees, again, independent of the trust, because those income tax reliefs come from the operation of either statutory employee share schemes or what I'm calling through this presentation general legislation employee share schemes. And then no capital gains tax charge for the trust. Why? Because the trust is offshore, typically sited in Jersey or Guernsey or the Isle of Man, where there's no capital gains tax regime. So a very, very powerful support mechanism from the general legislation for an employee share scheme, whether a statutory bespoke type legislation share scheme or indeed one from the general legislation. Let's go to the next slide. So here we're talking about a share purchase scheme. So I came across this scheme arrangement in abundance back in 2005, 2008, when I was making frequent trips to South Africa, to Cape Town and Johannesburg to work with companies there, where courtesy of the Black Empowerment movement, employee share schemes were de facto compulsory. But there was no real tax efficient legislation in those days in South Africa. So we had to work with the general legislation. Yeah, the general legislation is the phrase I'm using to describe these schemes, general legislation schemes. So what we did was we operated an arrangement whereby employees would receive a bonus arrangement up front at the outset of the scheme, non-contractual bonus, to be able to purchase shares. So either it would be to actually purchase the shares outright with the full value of the shares represented in the bonus, or alternatively to enable the employees to extinguish the liability by providing them with net monies which equated to the income tax and social security contributions which were due. But the important point about this scheme arrangement, well, there are a number of important points. Let me just try and tease them out for you. The first is that it provided the employees with market value monies which equated to the market value of the shares. So there was no discount to be taxed. Yeah. And the second thing is that when you actually recognize that those bonuses are taxable emoluments, the company gets a corporation tax deduction. Now, if you work through an example of the share purchase scheme, the way that I've just described it, some form of financial modeling using net present value discounted cash flow techniques, what you find is that it's very, very financially effective. Not just is it tax efficient, but it's commercially effective for both the employee and the employer. So this scheme is worth looking at. It really is. Now let's go to this next scheme, and this is called the it's what I call anyway, and when I write about these things in my books and articles, the share loan scheme. Now, clearly, we don't want any employee share scheme participant to be laden with debt. So the share loan type arrangement is most appropriate in circumstances where a director, say, is expected to meet share ownership targets soon after joining the company or within a short time scale of joining the company. So the debt is extinguished in quite a short period of time. But again, what we're doing here is we're providing monies to the employee. Typically it would be a director, a one-off type arrangement, to enable him or her to pay market value monies for the share. So there's no discount on which the individual can be taxed. Again, work with your discounted cash flow techniques, and this can show itself to be a very, very efficient mechanism all round. There was actually a change in the Companies Act legislation some years ago which facilitated the loan type arrangements. It made possible for a company to make loans to directors in these circumstances. Let's go to the next slide. So we're looking here at a form of gross shares model based upon a share reclassification procedure which comes from TCJA 1992, Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act, and also from the same act, the share valuation legislation, which facilitates a freeze. So in this type of growth model, and there are many types of growth model, but you know, I've got 20 minutes to talk to you today, haven't I? So this is a form of gross shares model. We freeze the whole company value in the existing share capital, yeah, so that we can then create a new class of shares alongside the existing share capital, which have zero value or nominal value market value, or maybe an element of value is attributed to them, but it's always very, very low. The existing share capital, which have the value freeze, well, they'll never be worth any more than that value freeze, ever, so that all gain attributes to the new class of shares, which we call the growth shares. Okay, so that's a form of a growth shares model, a very, very powerful form of growth shares model indeed. Let's go to the next slide. So the comparison between that type of growth shares model and the JSOP, the joint share option plan, well, the difference really is that when you're actually working with the type of growth shares model that I've just shared with you, you're always working with two classes of share. In the JSOP type model, you're working with one class of share which has two owners. That's the distinction. So typically, an employee share trust will be one of the owners. The other joint owner will, of course, be the employee. All gain is attributed to the employee's element. You see the concept. One thing to mention as another stark difference between that growth shares model I shared with you and the JSOP is that you could, if the company is eligible, work EMI with that growth shares model. Often it's used as a mechanism in companies where EMI is not available. And I think practitioners agree that if EMI had a more substantive span and scope, growth shares models wouldn't be in such abundance. But when it comes to the JSOP, it's not possible to use EMI. The EMI legislation never envisaged ownership by two parties of the same share, and it also never envisaged working with an interest in shares, only ownership of shares. So let's go to the next slide, and this talks about the tracker shares concept, a concept I came up with by accident some 20-25 years ago. I was seeking to find a solution for a client, and what it does is this. It's a class of shares. The tracker shares is a class of shares in the holding company, but it's linked to the value in the development of the value of the subsidiary company. So effectively, you've got a class of shares at holding company level, which represents solely the growth in value of the subsidiary company, and so you can actually use it to actually establish a subsidiary company scheme. Now, Finance Act 2003 abolished what was called the dependent subsidiaries legislation. The dependent subsidiaries legislation meant that all gain for a participant of a share scheme in a subsidiary company would fall into income tax. That went in 2003. So it's now possible to actually structure subsidiary type arrangements, whether through tracker shares or through any other type of concept that's applicable to a subsidiary company. It's now possible to actually structure the arrangements such that all gain falls into the less punitive capital gains tax. Okay, well, that takes us to a minute before 25 past. I hope that's suitable for you, Ian. Let's go to the final slide. So that's David Craddock, my good self, wishing you all the best for your business initiative on employee share schemes. If I can be of any help, you've got my contact details there to contact me. Look forward to hearing from you, and indeed looking forward to these questions, which are normally very informative. They really are normally very, very interesting questions indeed that we get from this audience. So bring them on. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. You've taken us on a whistle-stop tour of the tax techniques and the different types of employee share schemes. So my own head is full of questions, but I've also got questions coming in from the audience, and I think we will probably have room for one or two more questions if people in the audience have been saving their questions up. But let me just start with a question, I think a very interesting question here by Peter Horncastle, who says, what is the best approach for small companies with no value to their shares or market price? And how do you communicate the value of shares if there isn't a price? How do you communicate that to key management or to the people to whom you're trying to attract into the employee share scheme?
Yes, hello, Peter. Interesting set of questions there. it might well be that the company doesn't have value. Why is that? It might be that it's a startup. So there is a trajectory, there is a projection that you can share with the workforce, dependent upon, of course, whatever assumptions that projection is constructed. But yes, it might be there's zero value to start with. It might be that the company's fallen on bad times and there's no value. So again, there's a need to demonstrate that the involvement in the share scheme is part of an overall strategic plan to take the company out of the doldrums and back into boom times again. I mean, I remember back in the 80s, I think it was, we acted for a number of bus companies, and those bus companies had fallen on hard times, and employees were asked to take a significant pay cut in those cases in favour of taking shares. But there was always the plan, which was a rescue plan, to look for better days. So clearly, it's very, very important to keep the support of the workforce in those situations. But in relation to your first question, which scheme would you use? Well, if the company qualifies for EMI, then you'd work with EMI. Always the first port of call is EMI. It is so powerful in terms of tax relief. If you can't work EMI, then look for one of the others, which could be either a statutory scheme or some form of general legislation scheme, as I've described today.
Thanks very much for that, David. I've got a couple of questions here from Roli Attad. I can answer one of them.
Okay.
Roli Attad wants to know, how can we get hold of the presentation and the video recording? The presentation actually is already up on the website. If you want to pull the presentation down, Roli and indeed everybody, that's available to you now. The video recording usually goes up within, let's say, 48 hours or 2 working days. Sometimes sooner than that, and that will be up on the website as well. So it will be there for you to return to and look at or forward to your friends, however you wish. There is another question from Roli Attad, which is definitely a question for you and not a question for me, David, which is, does an employee share trust have a minimum 51% share sale from majority shareholders, and is it the same as an EOT?
So an employee share trust is a very different vehicle indeed from an EOT. An EOT does require, under Finance Act 2014, a 51% shareholding, and if the ownership falls below 51%, then it's no longer an EOT, and there's a clawback of the tax relief. We actually did a webinar on an EOT a couple of months back, and if you want to go back to that, then you'll find lots of information on that webinar. But suffice to say that the contrast with the employee share trust couldn't be greater. The employee share trust is a trading vehicle for the shares. The EOT does not offer itself as a trading vehicle. It stabilizes the shareholding. That's the way to see the EOT. Remember, we do lots of very interesting EOT type arrangements and lots of very interesting employee share trust arrangements. The EOT stabilizes the shareholding. It stabilizes the employment potential within that company. And it doesn't make it immune to a takeover, but it should be seen as an alternative to a takeover, certainly in the short to medium term. The employee share trust, it's a trading vehicle for the shares, and that trading can be piecemeal. It can be by one shareholder or a number of shareholders at different intervals or all at the same time.
David, thank you very, very much for that. I think that should answer Roli's question quite comprehensively. I've got a different question here from Nicholas Bertels. I think in some ways it's following up on Peter's question. And he asked, what's the best way for a startup that's had a number of key people adding significant value and wants to issue shares to those people as a thank you for their good work, although now the company has significant funding and will be employing some of those people and giving them any options? So it's we've sort of had the question about the startup where maybe you can't say that it has a value. What is the best way to do this with a company that maybe has already been on its rounds of fundraising? It's not really a fundraising exercise, but it is an exercise of trying to bind people in by thanking them and keeping them within the family.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you shares are good. and they can act as an element to bind people in. And there is some evidence, primarily coming from the US, going back over decades, which does demonstrate that. The real binders, though, are to keep them in for the future. And in summary, an employee share scheme will perform three functions. One is motivation and incentive to develop the company. Two is identification and involvement in the business going into the future. And the third is to actually recruit or retain them. So the really powerful reasons for involving individuals in shares are all futuristic, because that's where the gain is. And that's where you want the gain to be, because you're wanting to develop the company. So thank you shares. I'm all in favor of thank you shares, and we introduce thank you shares for various companies when they ask us. But it should always be combined with futuristic thinking on how to actually trigger that motivation and incentive and involvement and identification and retention through an active employee share scheme, which is looking for contribution to productivity, which in turn results in higher profits and a developing share value in which the individuals can participate in the future.
Thanks for that answer.
Do come back if there's any more on that. There were a number of angles to that question, Nicholas. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think it does answer Nicholas's question, but it also starts to address a sort of line of questioning that was going through my head all the time in this in today's talk, which is trying to link the tax efficient employee share technique with things like productivity and competitiveness and those things, which is really what we're aiming for here. Is there a body of evidence that shows that the companies that use these techniques tend to have higher productivity, improved competitiveness, or is it still too difficult to tell? There are too many factors involved.
The general rule, I'll come on to the evidence in a moment, but the general rule of thumb is that an employee share scheme properly constructed to the sensitivities of the company, properly implemented with strong administration, and properly communicated to the workforce in an environment where the directors are committed to employee participation, the general rule of thumb is that it will result in an increase in productivity, provided, of course, the company is operating with products that are competitive and in a market that does allow some element of market share. Now, the body of evidence is substantial. It goes back initially to the 1950s in the US, right up to the present day. Notable contributors are there's a report produced by Hewitt, some probably 20 years ago now, very, very powerful report with lots of good, strong internal controls, which are clearly explained in the report. There's a body of evidence produced by Rutgers University in the US, spelled R-U-T-G-E-R-S. Cass Business School over the last 10 years has become increasingly interested in the subject. Also the London Business School and the London School of Economics. And also Warwick University have done studies over the years. Keele University, Manchester Metropolitan, York University in the UK have all added to the luster of evidence available. In my book, Todd's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, there are a number of chapters completely devoted to explaining the evidence. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that on the ESOP Centre website, there's a very detailed set of slides that I produced for a European conference where the ESOP Centre was asked to participate some 6 or 7 years ago. So there are various places where you can find this information, and it's powerful. It really is.
Thanks for that, David. Because that also leads to my other sort of line of questioning on this, which is something that we've discussed privately before around these tax efficient schemes, obviously you're talking about inland revenue HMRC approved schemes here, but on the face of it, when you discuss these with the mythical Aunt Agatha, Aunt Agatha says offshore trusts and and no capital gains on the road. Well, isn't this just some sort of a tax dodge? And shouldn't you be spending your time actually doing good business rather than just coming up with tax schemes? That's not my view. That is the mythical Aunt Agatha view. But I'd like to hear your take on why this isn't like that. And yet we do find almost all of these things are operated through offshore trusts.
Well, if Aunt Agatha is Agatha Christie, she's obviously seeing things as something of a mystery, and we've got to demystify it for her, haven't we, I guess, really, Ian?
She's a P.G. Woodhouse character, I think.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, I think it's important to recognise that the UK Exchequer regards the regimes in Jersey and Guernsey as completely bona fide. They recognise that there's complete transparency, and they also recognise that Jersey and Guernsey, through their financial services commissions, their respective commissions, have purposely developed the islands to provide an administrative service on employee share schemes. The opportunity to operate these schemes comes from the UK legislation. The employee share trust is a support mechanism, as I indicated in my little piece on the employee share trust earlier. Different from the EOT, that's different. The EOT, of course, is always onshore, but the employee share trust, which is offshore, it acts as a trading mechanism for the shares. So it's acting as a market for the shares for the private company that doesn't have shares quoted on a recognised stock exchange. For the quoted company, it performs a different role. It acts as a sort of hedging and warehousing mechanism, typically working very closely with brokers on the mainland. So there's no indication of subterfuge assumed by the British Exchequer. And indeed, when the disguised remuneration legislation was introduced in 2011, Finance Act 2011, that's now represented in Part 7A of ITIPA 2003, there were carve-out provisions for employee share schemes and employee share trusts. So it's all very above board, Aunt Agatha, I'm afraid to say. Or please to say.
I'm convinced, but Aunt Agatha is a very difficult character.
Put her on to me with an email if she needs more, and that's fine.
Well, that actually leads nicely to our final question. It's a two-part question from Susan Jones, who I think is writing in actually from the States. As part of the question is, first of all, she says it was a terrific presentation, David, but she'd also like to know, are these tax techniques applicable to all countries? Is the first part of her question. The second part of her question is, if somebody would like you to do some EOT evaluation work, should they call you or email you? So there you go.
Well, I'll answer the second part first. Yes. Yes, any of these scheme arrangements, we are expert practitioners in introducing and indeed developing and implementing, whether it be an EOT or an employee share trust or an employee share scheme of any type. We typically work to develop an employee share scheme arrangement which is bespoke and sensitive to the needs of the client company. That's how we work. We work as detailed consultants. We seek to understand the business and therefore fine-tune the structure accordingly. The first question was about applicability to other countries. Okay, so I've talked today about tax techniques. Tax regimes will vary by country, and so therefore it's very, very important indeed to understand the tax regime in a particular country before you introduce that scheme, but recognize also that as well as being cognizant and aware of the tax laws of the country in which you introduce the scheme. You also need to be aware of the securities laws, which typically come to you through a Companies Act in a given country. The financial services law, so in the UK we have financial services regulations, and in all the English-speaking countries and indeed all Western countries, there is a developed financial service legislation. There's also employment laws, there's data protection laws. If you're working with a trust, how does the trust interface with the laws of the country in question? So it's important to always, when you're working with any given country, to understand how all those laws interact for that particular country and to develop the scheme accordingly. So hopefully, Susan, that answers that part of your question. Come back to me if you need more.
Yeah, and the answer to the part about do you email or phone, I'm sure David would pick up with any of you on any of those methods. Yeah. And David's contact details are there in the slides if you want to pick up the slides from the website afterwards. So really, it just remains for me to thank everybody, and I'm going to start. I suppose it's three types of thanks. First of all, once again, to thank the sponsors. These are the ESOP Centre members. Yet again, we're very, very grateful to you for your sponsorship and for your support of the activities of the ESOP Centre, and indeed the FS Club sponsors and members generally. This is the collection of all of those. I would also like to point out some of our other ESOP Centre and FS Club resources to you. So the website is rich with information for you. We have Newspad at the ESOP Centre, which is a very popular resource, and you can subscribe to that, and you can look at past copies of it on the website. We also have FS Club bulletins, some of them relevant to the ESOP Centre, others relevant to all manner of topics. We also have a wide-ranging programme of events for the FS Club. So on Wednesday, for example, we have practical examples at the cutting edge of natural language processing, which is a bit about AI and natural languages. On Thursday, asynchronicity and the future of the workplace should be very interesting. Webinar on that topic. Next week, we will be launching the Global Green Finance Index, the 8th edition of that. I can hardly believe that we're up to Index 8 on GGFI, but we are. And then on the Thursday, Escape from Model Land, the dangers of overconfidence in mathematical models. And then on Monday, Privacy by Design is essential to complementing regulatory compliance. You can see all of these forthcoming events and many, many more besides if you go to the website. I didn't want to do that. So that's a round of thanks to those people. Also a round of thanks to you, the audience. A terrific set of questions came in. Yes. Again this time, which makes for such an interesting discussion at the end of the talk. I'm very grateful to you for that. And then to thank David, and those of you who are fans of these know that I always try to have a musical instrument of some sort to thank David, because we can't give him the round of applause that we would give him if we were all gathered together in one hall. I do have to cycle my musical instruments around a little bit these days. I don't have enough musical instruments. This is what, the 8th, 10th time that we've done one of these things together, David, so I don't have that many musical instruments.
Number 12, actually. I did check out that before I came on air. Number 12 it is. Yeah, thank you very much.
Number 12. So I have used a bell before, but I thought I've got to use a bell for this. First of all, because a toll is a sort of tax, and I thought about the tolling of the bell, or I thought for whom the bell tolls. So John Donne popped into my head. No man is an island entire of itself, but of course Jersey and Guernsey are islands entire of themselves. And then of course you know for whom the bell tolls, David. It tolls for thee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Yeah.
And thanks to everybody. See you all again soon.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye.